then just do the screen share. And here we go. So, like I said in my email, if you received that, my original goal was to not skip anything, because I think that to have a sense of the Talmud, as a written document, you really can't just do the greatest hits. But there's a lot of material, and particularly since we're looking at Pesachim and the section dealing with the Passover Seder, that, like I said, there's about 5 pages of stuff on, apparently in Babylonia, there was this superstition about pairs. Okay, you couldn't do anything in pairs. If you did things in pairs, it was bad luck. It left you susceptible to demons, right? So the 4 cups of wine is a problem for pairs, because not only is it pairs, it's double pairs, right? So they're discussing that and whether it is a problem of pairs or not a problem with pairs. And some say it's not, because it's for good and not for bad. And then, as is often the case in the Talmud, and for those of you who, attend my classes or sometimes even my sermons, things get pretty stream of consciousness, right? So they start talking about all these other different superstitions that they had. And I'm sure, I'm sure that there are PhD students who write dissertations on the history of superstitions. And, if you're really interested in the history of superstitions, this is fun material. But for most of us, since we really, I think, want to learn about the development of the Passover Seder, I decided to skip that. So we'll pick up on page 114a, paragraph 4. Okay. So the beginning of the Passover Seder. The attendants poured the wine of the first cup for the leader of the Seder. Okay, now the Hebrew here, and this is one of the reasons that that it's a Mishnah and not Gemara, is, well, if you knew Hebrew or Aramaic well enough, right? It's Hebrew. And if it's Hebrew, that's from the Mishnaic layer, so from the earlier layer, whereas if it's later material, it's going to be in Aramaic. Okay, so it says Mazgulo Kos Rishon, which they translate here as poured the first cup. But, if you remember back a few weeks, we were learning about the rules for the wine used at the Seder. And if you remember, it had to be wine mixed with water. Okay, why wine mixed with water?
Well, the undiluted wine is too strong.
Right, it's too strong, right? And it's considered uncivilized, okay? And so Mazgulo really doesn't mean they poured him. It really means they blended him. And as we saw in what we studied a few weeks ago, the optimal ratio was 1-4. In other words, 3 parts water for 1 part wine. And I don't know about other Christian denominations, but in the Catholic Church, when they're preparing the wine for Mass, it's still water and wine. Yep. Okay, which is a strict lineal continuation of the Mishnaic practice. Okay, so but anyway, so they've mixed the first cup of wine for the later of the Seder. Bet Shammai says one recites the blessing over the day, and thereafter he recites the blessing over the wine. Okay, the blessing over the day is Mikadesh Yisrael, the Mikadesh Yisrael v'Hazmanim, who blesses Israel in the festival. And then you say Borei Pri Hagafen. And Beit Hillel says you recite the blessing over the wine and thereafter the blessing over the day. Right? Now, in other words, so let me go back, right? So when we say Kiddush for Shabbat, what do? We say Borei Pri Hagafen and then Mikadesh HaShabbat, right? So we're blessing the wine first, and then we're blessing the day, right? And similarly, when we're talking about the Kiddush at the Seder, which means the first cup, how do we do it, right? We say Borei Pri Hagafen, right? And then we go Asher Bachabanu Mikol Baromamanu Mishkol Hashon V'Kiddushanu V'Mitzvotav, right? And then it ends with Baruch Atah Adonai Mekadesh Yisrael V'Hazmani. Blessed are you, Adonai, who sanctifies Israel and the holy occasions, the holy festivals, right? So which one are we following when we do it that way?
Hillel.
Hillel, right? Because we're saying first the blessing over the wine, and after that the blessing over the day, right? And again, I mean, personally, I find it really interesting that we're looking at a document that's almost 2,000 years old, right? And telling you things that, like, everybody agrees was developed by the rabbis, right? There's nothing in the Torah that says have a Passover Seder, right? I mean, there are things in the Torah that say, you shall teach them to your children. When your children ask, this is how you shall answer, right? So the mitzvah to tell the story is arguably contained in the Torah, right? But the mitzvah to have 4 questions, 4 cups of wine, 4 sons, all of these things, nobody thinks that comes from the Torah, right? That was clearly developed by the rabbis. And yet 2,000 years ago, we're still doing it precisely the same way, right? Which I find it interesting that you study this material and then you're like, oh yeah, right? And you're probably saying, oh yeah, I didn't even realize we follow Beit Hillel and not Beit Shammai, but we do, okay? So that's from the Mishnah, right? So that's the earliest level, right? And now the next level, which is from the Tosefta, which is it is a collection of statements or teachings in Mishnaic Hebrew that is attributed to rabbis who appear in the Mishnah, but the Tosefta is not itself in the Mishnah. Okay, so it's handed down orally for centuries. Okay, Tanu Rabbanan, the sages taught in the Tosefta. These are the matters of dispute between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel regarding the halacha of a meal. The word is seudah, but seudah doesn't just mean like a meal. It means like a religious meal, right? That has a ritual around it, right? Like you might know the term Sudash Lishit, right? Or Shalis Shudas, right? That's Su'udah, the third Su'udah. All right. So a Su'udah has rules surrounding it. Okay. So these are the areas of disagreement. Beit Shammai says we say the blessing over the day, and afterward the blessing over the year, right? So if we were doing the Seder according to Beit Shammai, we would say first, Baruch atah Adonai mekadesh Yisrael v'hazmanim, and then go Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei peri hagafen. Right? Why does Beit Shammai say this? All right. Now it's interesting to me because if I was asking that question, why does the suggestion of Beit Shammai make sense? I would say that it makes sense is not the reasons that they give in the Tosefta. To me, the most obvious reason would be the idea of what's known as a hefsek. A hefsek meaning breaking off, right? In other words, like, all right, so at the beginning of a meal, right, we wash our hands, right? And then we don't talk until we say hamotzi, right? Why do we not talk between washing our hands and saying hamotzi? Why not? I mean, hey Stan, that this is what we practice, right? You wash your hands and then you don't talk. And if somebody speaks to you, why don't you talk between washing your hands and saying hamotzi?
It's a set. It's two blessings at one time.
Right. It's a hefsek, right? It's an interruption, right? You're washing your hands as preparation for saying hamotzi, right? It's not it's wash your hands, say hamotzi. It's not wash your hands, have a chat, walk around the block, say hamotzi, right? It's wash your hands, say hamotzi, right? So similarly, it would seem to me that if you said Borei Pri Hagafen, right, bless the wine, drink the wine, right? So saying the blessing for the day would be a hefsek, right? I mean, if frankly, if Beit Shammai said that, I would find that convincing. But that's not what Beit Shammai said. They said, they gave two reasons. One is, all right, you say the blessing over the sanctification of the day and thereafter the blessing over the wine, because the day causes the wine to come before the meal. In other words, why do we have wine, right? Why are we having wine? We're having wine because it's Shabbos. We're having wine because it's Pesach. We're having wine because it's Sukkot. We're having wine, right, because it's Rosh Hashanah, right? So if it wasn't that special occasion, we wouldn't be having wine. And therefore, the blessing over the wine should come first, because the occasion is the reason for the wine, right? And then the second reason that they give, the day has already been sanctified and the wine has not yet come. All right, that requires a little bit of unpacking, meaning, I mean, when does Shabbos or Yontif start? Right? I mean, assuming that you're observant and you're doing everything that you're supposed to do, right? So let's say Shabbos, okay? When does Shabbos start? What is the action which starts Shabbos for you? Right? It's not just, the clock hitting a certain hour. There are specific actions so that you could have in the same household some people for whom Shabbos has already started and some people for whom Shabbos has not started. Right?
Isn't the variance that some people at sundown and some people minutes after sundown?
No, I mean there are differences as to exactly when is the latest
that's
time
what-
for
that's
candle
what I thought
lighting,
the question was, yeah.
right? But all right, so in a traditional context, but you're nibbling on the edges of the right answer. Okay? In an orthodox context or a traditional context, if you're a woman, when does Shabbos start for you? When you
Like candles,
light candles.
right, bench lift or lift.
Right.
bench. Right.
When Shabbos starts for you when you light candles if you're a woman, and if you're a man, when does it start for you? When you're davening and you say Mizmor Shir L'Yom HaShabbat. Okay, Psalm 92. Okay, so the point is, I mean, put it this way. Shabbos doesn't start when you say Kiddush, right? It's already Shabbos. Could be, if you're having late dinner, right? You're having a late Shabbos dinner. Shabbos has started at 4:30, and you're not having Shabbos dinner till 7:30, 8 o'clock, right? You could have could be Shabbos already for 3-4 hours, right? So therefore, Shammai says, doesn't make sense to say the blessing over the day first, because you're not really doing anything. You're not inaugurating the day. The day could be several hours old, and we haven't had wine yet, right? So it doesn't make sense to start with Berei Pri Hagafen. It really makes sense to start with the blessing over the day, whether it's Shabbos or Pesach or whatever. I'm not saying that you should agree, okay? In fact, you shouldn't agree because that's not what you do. That's not what we do, right? But I will say that Shammai has their reasons, right? Shammai definitely has their reasons. Any questions or comments on that so far? Okay. And Beit Hillel says, no, you say the blessing over the wine and afterwards the blessing for the day, right? Why? Because the wine is what causes Kiddush to be said, right? If you didn't have wine, you wouldn't be saying Kiddush, right? Like nobody, I mean, it's hard to imagine anyway, right? But nobody's ever invited you over to their house and says, oh, we don't have any wine, but we're going to say Kiddush anyway, right? If you don't, I mean, no wine, no Kiddush, right? Although technically, if you don't have wine, and by wine, we don't necessarily, it doesn't have to be alcoholic, it could be grape juice too. But if you don't have Pri Hagafen, you could also say it over bread. But I've never seen that happen. Okay. The wine is more important because if we didn't have wine, we wouldn't be saying Kiddush, right? And another explanation, and here you've heard me explain this principle, Birkat hayayin tadira uvirkat hayom eina tadira. Okay, the blessing over wine is frequent, and the blessing over the day is infrequent. Tadir v'she'eino tadir, tadir kodem. All right, essentially something the more frequent thing takes precedence. The Hilchata Kedivre Beit Hillel, and the law is according to Beit Hillel. So let me explain this Tadir and She'eno Tadir, right? I mean, so if you have two mitzvot or two things that you should do at the same time, and you don't know which goes first, Tadir v'she'eno tadir, tadir kodem, right? The more frequent one takes precedent, okay? What's like the classic example of that, at least for observant men? Okay, yeah, Stan, Stan, go ahead.
Tefillin,
Say more.
what, putting on tefillin.
Right,
Oh, you can put on the arm tefillin, you can put on the head tefillin. And if you put the wrong one on, you can still say the blessing for the other.
right, but you had it right, and then I said say more, and you undid what you had right, unfortunately.
Well, it's your fault.
Okay, yes, my fault. What do you put on before you put on tefillin?
Talit,
Talit. Why do you put on the talit before you put on the tefillin?
you put on talit every day,
And tefillin
and 6 times a week.
6 times a week, right? Bingo. Tadir v'she'eno tadir, tadir kodem, right? What in this case, what is the tadir? The tadir is the talit,
Talit.
because you put on the talit every day, right? Tefillin is she'eno tadir, because you don't put on tefillin every day, right? You put it on 6 days a week. You also don't put it on Yontif, right? And then depending on what your practice is, some people do put it on tefillin on Chol Moed, some people don't, right? But there are 52, there's like 60, 70, 80 days a year that you don't put on tefillin. I mean, most Jews, there's more than 60, 70, 80 days a year that they don't put on tefillin, but I'm talking about somebody who's observant. I'll get to you in a second, right? So that on this principle of the more frequent comes first, Talis comes before tefillin, right? In the same way that if we have two maftirs, right? We have like Rosh Chodesh and Hanukkah, right? So we read the Rosh Chodesh one first because there's 14, 15, 16 days a year of Rosh Chodesh. There's 8 days a year of Hanukkah. So Rosh Chodesh is Tadir compared to Hanukkah. So similarly, now why is the blessing over wine Tadir compared to the blessing over the day? Because, well, you don't necessarily say, Borei Pri Hagafen 7 days a week, right? But you could, right? You could have wine 7 days a week. You only have one Shabbos a week, right? You only have, well, one Seder, now 2 Seders if you live in the diaspora. Okay, now D, I didn't forget you. But you need to unmute.
Okay? Okay.
Yeah.
Obviously, not being male, I'm not familiar with a lot of what goes into the issue of tefillin. But why not every day?
Because you don't wear tefillin on Shabbat and you don't wear it on Yontif.
Okay,
I mean, that's the short answer.
right.
Right,
Because
so
I've been following
therefore
that
the
same
talus
law.
is more frequent than tefillin.
Okay,
Okay, so that's, so that's the classic example of Tadir v'she'eno Tadir. Okay. All right, now, my devar acher. Why does Hillel need? What is alternatively? In other words, why did Hillel need to give two reasons? Right? They gave two reasons. They said the wine takes precedence because the wine is the whole reason we're saying Kiddush. We wouldn't be saying Kiddush without wine. And also because of and then the Devar Acher, the other explanation is the Tadir and Sheno Tadir. So then the Gemara says, why did Beit Hillel need to cite an additional reason? Okay, and if you say that Beit Shammai cite two reasons, and here Beit Hillel offers only one, therefore Beit Hillel said they are two reasons here too. When a frequent practice and an infrequent practice coincide, the frequent practice takes precedent over the infrequent practice. In other words, so the question is why, right? Why does Hillel feel the need to give two reasons? And you might say, well, Shammai gave two reasons, so Hillel should give two reasons also, because maybe it's just a question of like toting up the number of reasons. All right. And then the Gemara goes on to say, V'hilchata kedivrei Beit Hillel, and the halacha is in accordance with the statement of Beit Hillel. And then the Gemara says, Pshita. Okay, Pshita means, well, this is obvious. Dahana fake bat call, because there was a bat call, there's a divine voice. Eva eat ema kodem bat call. If you want, I could say this was before the bat call. Okay, now, this requires a lot of unpacking, right? This requires a lot of unpacking. The Gemara is assuming that, hey, if you're studying Gemara, you know what I'm talking about, right? But what is a bat call? A bat call is a heavenly voice, a divine voice, okay? And there is a Gemara that says that Hillel and Shammai argued for years and years and years about all kinds of different things. And then a bat call, a divine voice, came out from the heavens and says, Halacha kedivrei Beit Hillel b'chol davar. All right, the law is always according to Beit Hillel, right? And therefore, so the Gemara is right. The Gemara entertains possibilities only to rule them out. Okay, I mean, I never went to law school, so but do they do this in secular law too? Like they raise issues to rule them out, lest somebody in the future say, well, if they had thought of this, they would have ruled differently.
Yes.
Right. So, so to preempt that, they say, we did think of this. We did think of this. Don't say we didn't think. We thought of it, but we don't accept it. Okay. So the Gemara is entertaining the possibility that you might say, well, you don't even need to tell me that the law is according to Beit Hillel, because I know that the law is according to Beit Hillel, because the law is always according to Beit Hillel, because of the bat call, because of the divine voice. Okay, so the Gemara is saying, Iba eat ema, if you wish, say that this Tosefta was taught before the divine voice and proclaim that principle, right? In other words, yeah, we know that it's according to Beit Hillel because of the divine voice, but this whole discussion took place before the divine voice. So we don't know that, okay? Let's go on to 9. But if you want, I could say that this took place even after the bat call, but Rabbi Yoshua, because this is according to the opinion of Rabbi Yoshua, the Amar, Ein Mashkichin Bevat Kol. Because Rabbi Yoshua said, we pay no attention to a divine voice. Right? You know that story that this is referring to? Right? The whole argument about the oven and whether the oven could be made pure after it wasn't pure. And there was the argument between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. And Rabbi Eliezer, what is the word I'm looking for? Rabbi Eliezer produces a bat kol. Right? Rabbi Eliezer produces a bat kol, and the bat kol says the law is according to Rabbi Eliezer. Right? And Rabbi Yoshua gets up and says, Lo b'shamayim hi, right? It's not in heaven. God, you told us not to pay attention to a bat kol, right? So you could say that this was after the bat kol, but it doesn't matter because we don't pay any attention to a bat kol. In other words, the point is that if I want to convince you of something, I need to convince you of it and not simply assert it. Right? Now ultimately, look, I mean, this is a complicated thing, right? I mean, here's where like the rubber hits the road in terms of actual shul governance, right? I mean, there are certain things where, there's a variety of legitimate practices within the conservative movement, and therefore the ritual committee or the board can make a decision, right? But then there are certain things where this is a halachic question, and it is up to the rabbi to decide the halachic question, right? Now, if I'm at a ritual committee meeting and the ritual committee says to me, Rabbi, would you please explain to us why you ruled the way that you ruled? That is absolutely a legitimate request for the ritual committee to make. Right? If the ritual committee says, I move to overrule the rabbi, that's not a legitimate thing for the ritual committee to do. But conversely, if the ritual committee says to me, would you please explain to us the rationale behind your decision? And I say, I don't have to explain it to you, I'm the rabbi. That's also not the way the system works, right? You have every right to ask me to explain. In fact, you should, because this is learning Torah, right? You should ask me to explain, and I should not say simply, I don't have to explain because I'm the rabbi. But on the other hand, certain things we don't just vote, right? That it's decided according to a halachic process, right? So the fact that, we had that bat kol that said that we always follow Hillel and not Shammai, ultimately, Rabbi Yoshua got rid of the bat kol, right? Because essentially, what did Rabbi Yoshua do? Rabbi Yoshua quoted God against God, right? And said, hey, God, you told us not to pay any attention to you. You said that in the Torah. Yeah, D.
This is really dumb, but not you, this question. Even today, I don't mean this in any way to be disrespectful.
Not at all.
Can't a rabbi or a cleric say there's a bat kol on this, or I heard a bat kol on? What's to say that making that statement is legitimate other than in faith or in trust?
It's never legitimate.
Okay.
It's never legitimate. I mean, I would say, for one thing, because now we know about schizophrenia, right? And if I mean, seriously, right? If I gave a sermon and I said, God spoke to me and told me X, Y, and Z, you would, I think, legitimately say, Rabbi, maybe you ought to go see a psychiatrist and be tested for schizophrenia. Right? Now, what that does to all the prophets and Moses and so on, that's above my pay grade, right? But I would legitimately say that the normative Jewish position is that after the destruction of the temple, that form of communication no longer occurs. Okay? It may have occurred, it does not any longer occur, right? I mean, I think that there's a difference between you as and here's what I would say, because I think it's a very legitimate question. Okay? I think it is very legitimate for me to say, I think God is telling me to do this thing and I have to do it. Okay. Like, I don't know, when I organized the trip to the border, right? And the shul was very supportive, right? But if the shul had said to me, Rabbi, we don't think that that's appropriate, and you need to not go on that trip, I think I might have said, look, I'm sorry, but I think God is calling on me to do this. And, if you want to fire me because of it, then you're going to fire me, but I have to do this because God is calling on me to do it, right? But it's one thing for me to say, God is telling me that I need to do something. And it is another thing for me to say, God is telling me that you, D, need to do something, right? Or God is telling me that the shul needs to do something, right? That I think.
I
I
thought
mean, so thank you for asking that question, because it helped me to kind of clarify.
I thought you were going to say, there's a difference between you're saying, God is telling me to do this, or in my heart, this is something that I need to do. And there's a very big difference between the two.
Well, I would use those two phrases interchangeably,
Okay.
right? Because while there have been times in my life when I was fairly clear that God was telling me to do something, it was never auditory, right? I never actually heard a voice, right? And I do think at the point where like you hear a voice rather than like reaching moral certainty in your heart, I think that that's possibly crossing over into, something that you really need to worry about.
You're using me figuratively. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay.
And yet on the basis of this divine voice emerging, Hillel wins the day, right, for all time, right?
Well, but now this Gemara says, nah, it doesn't. Right? I mean, because the fact of the matter is,
Yes.
or you could, yes, you're right. I mean, this is, the question is whether that undoes the divine voice or not, right? I mean, because the dispute between Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Eliezer was many hundreds of years later, right? Hillel and Shammai are before the destruction of the temple, right? And I mean, Hillel and Shammai are roughly contemporaneous with Jesus.
Oh.
Okay. And Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer are many centuries later. Okay. But I could also say that the bat kol is simply pragmatic. In other words, I mean, it's the same thing in any legal system, right? I mean, the Supreme Court makes a ruling. That ruling is final, right? Does it mean that the Supreme Court is right?
No.
No, right? I mean, I would say that the decision that the Supreme Court made in, I forget the name of the case where they reversed Roe v. Wade.
Dobbs.
Hmm?
Dobbs.
Dodge, right?
Dobbs. Yeah.
Dobbs, right. The Dobbs decision was wrong. Is it authoritative? Yeah, it's authoritative because in any legal system, you have to have a last word, right? If you don't have a last word, you have anarchy, right? And so as a pragmatic thing, Dobbs is now the law of the land until, God willing, it'll be reversed once again some years down the line. I mean, chances are none of us will be around for it, but but similarly, in other words, I got to know who to follow. Does it mean that Hillel is right and Shammai is wrong? No, it just means that Hillel is authoritative and Shammai is not authoritative. Except in there are a handful of cases where the halacha is according to Beit Shammai, but generally it's according to Beit Hillel. Okay. Let's go on. The attendants brought vegetables before the leader of the Seder prior to the meal if there were no other vegetables on the table. Haviu lifanav mitabel b'chazeret ad shemagia leparperet. He dips the chazeret, which is like lettuce, into water or vinegar to taste some food before he reaches the dessert of the bread, i.e. the bitter herbs, which were eaten after the matzah. Okay, they brought before him matzah and chazeret and haroset, and at least 2 cooked dishes in honor of the festival. Okay, so you have to have 2 cooked dishes. The Tana comments that this was the practice, although eating haroset is not a mitzvah, but merely a custom. Rabbi Eliezer ben Sadok says, actually, it is a mitzvah to eat haroset. And in the period when the temple stood and they offered the Paschal lamb, they brought before him the body of the Paschal lamb. Okay, so there's a disagreement between the sages and Rabbi Eliezer ben Sadok about whether it is a mitzvah to eat haroset or not, whether it's a mitzvah or just, something that we do. And then when the temple stood, they also brought, the Paschal lamb, right? I mean, that was the main course, right? All right, so now I don't know how far we're going to get because this next Gemara is going to be requiring some unpacking as well. Amar Reish Lakish Zoto Merit Mitzvot Srichot Kavana. Kevan de la be'idan chiyuva de marohu de achile beborei pri ha'adama. Okay. Reish Lakish said this is to say that mitzvot require intent. One who performs a mitzvah must do so with the intent to fulfill his obligation. The proof of this from the Mishnah is that since one does not eat the lettuce at the time of his obligation to eat bitter herbs, he eats it after reciting only one blessing who creates the fruit of the ground, Borei Pri Adamah. And clearly the reason is that perhaps he did not intend to fulfill his obligation to eat bitter herbs, and therefore he needs to dip it again for the purpose of bitter herbs. For if it could enter your mind that mitzvot do not require intent, why do you need 2 dippings? But he has already dipped the lettuce once. Okay, so I have to say this is very complicated, and I'm not sure that I myself understand it fully. Okay, but the question is, first of all, why 2 dippings? Right? And the answer, according to Reish Lakish, is because the first dipping you might not have, because chazeret is bitter. It's like lettuce, right? It's usually lettuce. And you could fulfill the mitzvah of eating bitter herbs with the lettuce, but we don't. We fulfill it with the horseradish or whatever, or a different type of lettuce, right? Because of the idea of mitzvot srichot kavanah, right? That the idea of mitzvot require intention, right? I mean, and this is a debate within the halacha, right? Whether mitzvot require intention or not. For example, right, it's a mitzvah to hear the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, right? It's a mitzvah to hear the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, right? I haven't heard the shofar, but I go out for a stroll on Rosh Hashanah morning, and I'm walking by a shul, and I happen to be walking by the shul when they're sounding the shofar, and the guy sounding the shofar is really strong and really loud, and I happen to hear the shofar as I'm walking by the shul. Have I fulfilled the mitzvah to hear the shofar or not?
No, not if kavanah is required.
Not if kavanah is required. Why not?
Well, it wasn't your intention to hear it. You just happened to hear it as you were strolling.
I just happen to hear it, right? So there's no kavanah.
Yes.
But
But
let's suppose that, like, oh yeah, today's Rosh Hashanah, right? Maybe I'm like such an irreligious Jew that I don't even realize that today's Rosh Hashanah. But I'm out for a stroll and I hear the shofar. And then I say to myself, today's Rosh Hashanah, I need to hear the shofar, right? So I've made that now a kavanah, right? Now I fulfilled my obligation because I made the kavanah to fulfill the obligation, right? If I just randomly heard it and I wasn't, right? This is on the assumption that mitzvot srichot kavanah. But if we say mitzvot einon srichot kavanah, that mitzvot don't require kavanah, then if I heard it, I fulfilled it even if I had no intention to fulfill it, because in point of fact, I heard it, right? So the question is whether mitzvot srichot kavanah, okay? And Rish Lakish said they do, and that's why you have 2 dippings, because you dipped once and you didn't have kavanah, okay?
Rabbi,
Yeah.
I can't remember where I heard this, but there's a conversation that was held, and maybe it was in the Siddur, I don't know. I mean, in the Seder, but there's a conversation about the person who goes through prayer and ritual and study and whatever as a mechanical process with no real heart substance in doing that. as opposed to the person who from the heart is going through the service or whatever is going on. And then the third category, the one who doesn't know anything, but is learning with intent and purpose. I don't know what I'm connecting this to, but I know I heard something else that relates to this.
Right. Well, I mean, it's
other
it's in Mishnah Brachot that you should not make your prayer routine. Okay, that your prayer should not be routine, it should be with kavanah, right? And ideally that is the case, right? Now, in point of fact, sometimes you have kavanah and sometimes you don't have kavanah, right? And there's also the statement that the person who does something because they're commanded is at a higher level than a person who does something but is not commanded. Now, personally, I don't like trying to rank Jews, good, better, best, right? Because nobody knows the heart of another person, right? But I would say I can make the argument, and I'll wrap up with this. I can make the argument that under certain circumstances, it is a higher religious act to pray without kavanah than with kavanah, right? In other words, right, two people wake up on Shabbos morning, right? And the first person says, "Oh, I have such joy in my heart. And I'm so privileged to be able to go to shul and give thanks to God who has given me all these wonderful things. And I love the words of the liturgy and the beautiful voice of the cantor. And it's going to be such a spiritual high, and I'm going to get so much out of it." Right? And the other person gets up and they says, "Ugh, I didn't get enough sleep, and I have a headache, and I feel like crap, and I really don't want to go to shul, but I'm going to go to shul anyway because it's a mitzvah to go to shul." Right? I could make the argument that the second person is on a higher level, right? Because they're doing it out of obedience and not because they're gaining anything from it, right? But I could also make the argument that the first person is who we should strive to be. Second person is who we often are. And, who am I to say higher, better Jew or worse Jew? Right? But anyway, so in 2 weeks, we'll go on with this, and we're getting more into and what's actually a mitzvah and what's not a mitzvah, and you'll see that there's not agreement about all of this. All right?
All right.
Yeah,
All
Shakar.
right. Thank you. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Bingo.